Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are talking about evolution, and hopefully, at this point, you have already viewed the Ed puzzle that Mrs. Saunders developed, talking about the various types of evidence available to support the theory of evolution. Today, I'm going to be going over the couple of different theories that have been presented about the theories of evolution. Throughout the year, there have been a lot of different attempts to talk about where life came from. We had the idea of spontaneous generation, where we had maggots coming from rotting meat. When Reddy's experiment and Spallanzani's experiment led to the confirmation through Louis Pasteur's experiment that living things cannot come from non living things. This is the idea that biogenesis is not actually where life comes from. Uh, Living things give rise to other living things. And the evidence for that was proven by Louis Pasteur. But number two here, we have the use and disuse theory proposed by Jean Baptiste Lamarck. In 1809, he uh, presented the idea of the characteristics that you develop during your lifetime or acquired traits could be passed on to your offspring. And in some cases, this seems pretty logical. In the case of uh, a neck in a giraffe, as a giraffe's neck gets longer, each successive generation following has that long neck. And so, gradually, over many, many, many generations, the neck of the giraffe developed to be the long structure that it is today. And he also suggested that if an organ was not used, that it would deteriorate or it would degrade, as it is. And this happens with muscles. It happens with the tails in humans because we didn't need tails. They became less and less pronounced in our body. The appendix is an example of this. And in fact, you could look at any of those vestigial traits. Vestigial structures were discussed in the previous video, so you can feel free to go back and look at it. These are structures that are no longer useful in our body, like the tailbone or pinkies or baby toes or your appendix and so on. But there was a experiment done by Weissman, shown underneath my little graphic there. Weissman disproved this idea of acquired traits being passed on by cutting tails off of mice, mating them, and showing that the offspring still had tails. In Lamarckian evolution, it's suggested that a small claw might attract a mate, but a small claw gets bigger from usage. And this is based on a need or a use. So that claw gets bigger, and over successive generations, that claw becomes larger and larger until all offspring that are made end up having this larger claw. That doesn't necessarily ring true, however, with the evidence that we have. So, in the fossil record, we can look at the physical remains of organisms, and we see that there is a gradual change over time. There's a geographic distribution of living species, which shows that there's going to be some common ancestral species that other more modern varieties came from. There are going to be homologous body structures, which implies that there are similar genes. But again, back in the 1800s and early 1900s, we didn't understand the idea of what genes are and what DNA codes for in our bodies. We also had similarities in early development, which is, the ontogeny and developmental stages that we go through. Again, reflecting the influence of genes in our body structures. So then we have, in contrast to Lamarckian evolution, which is the idea of use and disuse. Things that you use, like if I work out, my muscles get bigger. It is quite obvious to us today that if I work out and I hit the gym and I get ripped, if my wife and I have another kid, my baby is not going to be born jacked up, ready to do push ups and pull ups like crazy. That's not how it works. All right. Our genes, what we understand now, our genes give us the potential to become what we end up becoming in our adulthood. And Charles Darwin's idea, who we're going to be talking about a little more in depth here, was in response to the environment's effect on our different characteristics that we have. He was born in England. He joined the crew of a ship, the HMS Beagle, as the naturalist. So his job was to document the organisms, the flora and fauna that they would encounter on a trip. They left from the British Isles. They sailed down to South America, around no, I apologize. So we've got our arrows are showing here. They go down around the South American tip. They get to the Galapagos Islands, which was a huge influence on Darwin's experience. And then they sailed west around towards New Zealand, around Australia, and back again to England. So on his trip, he developed through his experiences and observations the evidence that led him to propose a revolutionary hypothesis about how life changed over time. There are two videos that are linked on here. To get to these links, all I ask you to do is go to the slideshow that I'm going through, click on evolution. We know how to spell here. This should say evolution of lactose, and the Galapagos finch evolution video. Both of those explain how lactose digestion evolved in us, as well as how the finch population on the Galapagos Islands developed over time. He was, let's see, most of these things, these are the organisms that he looked at most frequently on his trip. The Galapagos Islands I mentioned were very important in foundational to his understanding of the process of change over time. He looked at tortoises, iguanas, and finches primarily. So he noticed that there are different shells for different tortoises on different islands. Each island had its own unique versions of tortoises, its own unique versions of iguanas, and its own unique versions of finches. And his question was, where did they all come from? Did they start here, or did they arrive here and develop over time? Well, what we were actually able to determine, and this finding was uh, documented and supported by our more modern genetic testing abilities. We could actually look at the DNA codes of these finches now, and we can see that the foundation or the founding population of all the finches on the different islands are originated from the mainland of South America, an original founding population that migrated to the islands. So there are a couple scientists and writers that were very influential to Darwin's thoughts. Thomas Malthus, who was an economist, said that if populations continue to grow, eventually there are going to be limitations on space, food, anything that you need. So if it's mating territory, if it's feeding territory, if it's water, limitations on oxygen or carbon dioxide, if you're a fish population potentially, anything that you could run out of and compete with others for, eventually there's going to be a limit to the available resources. And that means some are going to not make it. Charles Lyell is a geologist who proposed the Earth was much, much older than it was originally thought to be. And Darwin recognized that his discussion of the gradual long-term changes of the Earth's surface would have an impact on the changes in the populations of organisms that could live there. So in 1858, he was corresponding with another scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, and it really sparked for Darwin the need to publish his thoughts. In science, there is an old adage: you either publish or perish. And I know that my students that are listening to this, we talked about this early on in the school year when we talked about scientific writing. We said, all right, well, if you don't document what you've done, then in reality, there's no evidence, there's no paper trail that you ever had those thoughts. So it's very important for scientists to publish their thoughts. And it was this correspondence with Alfred Russel Wallace that sparked for Darwin the need to publish all the findings that he had, or it would be as if his entire trip had been wasted because there was no documentation in scientific writing of his thoughts. So, in this, he wrote a controversial book called On the Origin of Species. He had originally provided this manuscript for this book to his wife and said, in the event that I die, you need to give this manuscript to the publisher to have it published, because in reality, at that time period, the idea of evolution, the idea of a change in species over time, uh, really conflicted with the idea of creationism. And the Roman Catholic Church, as well as a lot of religious sects, would have been very combative. We'll say combative because they have a history of killing people who contradict them, and so Darwin didn't want to be subjected to that. So he was delaying as long as he could. And this is where the term natural selection comes from, because Darwin argued that the variations he saw on the island mattered. He said plants and animal breeders in Europe have been choosing crops and livestock that they want, and they've been doing what's called artificial selection, which is where humans choose the characteristics that are most desirable and breed them to maintain or increase the yield of those individuals. So artificial selection is humans choosing the characteristics that are most desirable and breeding them. Well, he extrapolated this and said, hey, there's going to be a struggle for existence, for food, for light, for if you're a plant, for living space. Darwin said that that's going to lead to some individuals having a better fitness. Now, fitness is not about strength, but it is about the number of organisms that you can produce. How many fertile offspring can you produce that survive? And the fitness of an organism is based on what adaptations or variations that you have that make you better able to compete with other individuals in your environment. Individuals with better fitness that have the adaptations and variations to be able to survive better will be able to make more babies. They're going to produce offspring that are similar to themselves, and the population is going to gradually change over time. This is what Darwin referred to as natural selection. So this is in contrast to artificial selection. Darwin's theory of natural selection included ideas of overproduction, meaning more babies are going to be created than can possibly survive, which means some individuals are going to die. Individuals have to have heritable variations, meaning those variations that they have to be able to be passed on. If I lose my arm in a tragic farming accident, it is not going to mean that my babies are going to be armless or be born with smaller arms. In reality, that is not a heritable trait. The only traits or variations that can be passed on are those that are found in the genetic material of our gametes, our sex cells. Those individuals with the best variations that receive those are going to survive and make more babies. Because of the direct and indirect competition that occurs in an environment, those individuals that are better equipped to survive will breed, make more babies, and uh, repopulate. Darwin proposed that natural selection looks different, makes organisms look different than their ancestors. This is called descent with modification. So, descent, meaning your descendants, your offspring, will have the modifications that you possess. And there is going to be a common descent of all species from a common ancestor. Now, in genetics, we talk about how some variations can be passed on. And one of the big examples of evolution in bacteria is the development of antibiotic resistant bacteria. When you get sick or you have a respiratory infection, you might take an antibiotic. This is going to kill bacteria that are found in your respiratory tract, or if you have an infection in your leg or your skin or an organ, they give you antibiotics. Right? Those are designed to kill bacteria. If you don't kill all the bacteria, then those individuals that survive are the individuals that are most resistant to whatever antibiotic they're being exposed to. Those are the bacteria. In this case, the little orange guy here. If this is the only bacteria that survives the application of antibiotic, if he's not killed, then he's going to reproduce himself because all the other ones die. And now you've cleared the way for him to reproduce and make more of him. All right. So all these squiggly ones are the dead bacteria. They decompose and break down, but now there's space for the resistant bacteria to breed and cause a greater infection. That's why it's so important for us to complete cycles of antibiotics that our doctors have given us. Historically, people used to only be given like a 4-day cycle of antibiotics. Now it's not uncommon to have 10 to 14 days or even longer of antibiotics because you need to make sure that you kill the bacteria that are present. Important points of evolution through natural selection. Here we go. Variations among organisms are due to chance. It is a random variation that frequently occurs in the gene pool. It is not planned. And so in genetics, we talked about how random mutations are a source of variation. Well, that's true in natural selection. If you have a variation that randomly shows up, just a random genetic mutation that causes a change in maybe the color of your feathers or your fur or the color of your wings, then if that variation allows you to exist or compete for nutrients or space or materials more effectively, then you win. You won the lottery. Natural selection selects for organisms that are best adapted for their environment. So if the environment changes, though, that means the selected traits might change, and that forces evolution to proceed faster. All right, we looked at geographic distribution of species because they have so many similarities between these types of, these are all in the rodent family. All right, but there are different rodents that have had different characteristics selected for based on their environment. So that forced their development or evolution over generations to become more perfectly able to survive in that environment. Darwin's theory summarized here, individuals in nature differ from one another. There's going to be some natural variation, and that variation needs to be heritable. Organisms produce more babies than can survive. Many die. Think of turtles that are all the eggs laying out on the beach, and then they all emerge at once, and they have to make this frantic gauntlet run to the water. And in that passage, they are picked off by all sorts of predators. Lots of predators will eat the babies. Because more are produced than can possibly survive, members of each species compete for the limited resources available. Because organisms are unique, each has an advantage or a disadvantage in the struggle for existence. Individuals best suited for their environment can survive, they make more babies, and they pass on those heritable traits. Over long periods of time, natural selection causes changes in the characteristics that we see in a species. So we talk about evolution of a population. We don't talk about an individual evolving. You are stuck with what you have, and you can't really change. And all organisms on Earth are united into a single tree of life with a form of common descent from a common ancestor. Macroevolution is large scale evolutionary. This little triangle is delta, which means change. Large scale evolutionary changes that take place over long periods of time. There's mass extinctions. This forces some evolutionary change. There's adaptive radiation, and this is the idea of organisms spreading out into different niches or areas of the environment. There's convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is the idea that individuals or organisms that are very different can evolve similar characteristics because they live in a similar environment. And then there's coevolution. This is two organisms that have evolved to interact together, and they have physical characteristics that make them perfectly adapted to interact with each other. And then there's punctuated equilibrium, which is a change over time based on some tragic or catastrophic event that causes mass extinctions. And then there's changes in the genes, and changes in the genes are a result of random mutation. Mass extinctions, as a result of, in this case, of the dinosaurs, you can talk about meteorite impacts, or you could talk about ice ages, massive volcanic eruptions. In earth science, you probably learned about the volcanic cauldron that is Yellowstone National Park. And if that giant volcano that's found underground were to erupt, that super volcano would cause massive extinction levels. Continental shifts changes the connections between different land masses, and if those land masses are separated, then that often means that individuals can't interbreed. And if they can't interbreed, then you get adaptive radiation. This is individuals who are going to interbreed with other individuals that are most like themselves. And so you get individuals that are perfectly adapted for a certain niche. Dinosaurs ruled, mammals were small. But when the dinosaurs disappeared, the adaptive radiation of mammals was opened up. They could take over the space that the dinosaurs had originally occupied. This happened when new species are introduced. We see this with invasive species frequently, especially now. We talk about all the different types of invasive species that are affecting our environment now, they are having an impact on the evolution of organisms over time. This picture shows the different types of beaks of the finches that Darwin saw on the island. Some of them are ground finches, some of them are tree finches. Some of them have large, heavy beaks, some of them have pointy beaks. So there's lots of different characteristics that evolved. Convergent evolution, I mentioned earlier, is organisms that live in a similar environment but are not actually related, but they have evolved because they live in a similar environment to have physical structures that are similar. A shark is not a mammal, a dolphin is a mammal, and a penguin is not a mammal. Uh, Penguins are birds, so they lay eggs. Dolphins have live births, and sharks, well, sharks are kind of funny like that. Some actually produce egg sacs, and there are actually some sharks that have eggs that they produce that will hatch internally, and then they give birth to a live young. It's so sharks are kind of a mixed bag. It's hard to talk about them. Um, Coevolution is the idea that organisms evolved in relationship to another organism. A great example of this is hummingbirds and flowers. They have evolved these long probing beaks to be able to reach into flowers to get nectar. And in doing so, those birds that had the longest, pointiest beaks were able to get more nectar. And so they met their physical needs for food and they made more babies. And those babies had the long beaks that their parents had. So there is some truth to the old adage that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, meaning we are often very like our parents, whether you like it or not. In the modern theory of evolution, in 1901, Hugo de Vries suggested that mutations cause variations. The limitations of Darwin's ideas were that he could not tell where the variations came from. It's de Vries that suggested that it's mutations. And Malthus proposed that there was a limited amount of food, which results in that competition we talked about earlier in Darwin's theory. Now we know, but now because we know about DNA and genes, we've evolved the theory a little bit. So genes that are best variations of a particular trait will be passed on to offspring because the parents survive. As favorable genes increase, those organisms tend to survive better. So genes with a low survival value, all right, we call that a high mortality. All right, so if you don't survive, you have a high mortality rate, meaning you die quickly. All right, if conditions in the environment change, these genes that are selected for may change. Industrial melanism and antibiotic resistance are examples of how the environment can change to cause the population to be shifted. The variations or new traits in a species arise from sexual reproduction and mutations. These are in bold down here at the bottom. You need to make sure you know those. Sexual reproduction and mutation are the sources of all the changes that occur in our genes in our populations. Whoops. The heterotroph hypothesis is a theory of how life began on Earth, though, and this is a far cry from talking about how organisms change over time. This is an effort of scientists to explain where life came from in the first place. Right? We have to try and propose a theory for whether or not life came from a mysterious, all-powerful deity of some sort, or if in some way it developed spontaneously on Earth. All right. Well, the heterotroph hypothesis is the hypothesis that proposes that organic molecules are formed in the ocean, and those molecules were combined using energy from the environment, like lightning or volcanic or geothermal heat. Eventually, these molecules randomly assembled to produce living things. This is there's a big jump to be made here, and this is the hardest thing for scientists to really convince people of. The first organisms on the planet were they were heterotrophs who had to consume organic materials from the environment to assemble more molecules. And because the environment of primitive Earth has low oxygen, there was no way. This was the only way, I should say, you could lead to something like aerobic respiration. Without oxygen in the environment, you'd have to do anaerobic respiration. But gradually over time, all that anaerobic respiration changed the atmosphere so that aerobic organisms could evolve. Again, it's a change in the environment leading to a change in the organisms that can survive. And so as CO2 levels increased, or in some cases, I could say it decreased in different scenarios, all right? But these variations allowed for photosynthetic organisms to evolve. Those photosynthetic organisms would produce oxygen because there was high levels of carbon dioxide in the primitive environment. Uh, that led the way for aerobic organisms to evolve. In 1953, there was a groundbreaking experiment, the Miller and Urey experiment, that was able to show that amino acids could be produced in an environment with nothing organic in it. Uh, Now, there are two theories. Once you have life on the planet, you have two theories or proposed methods in which organisms change over time. It's gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium and gradualism are outlined right here. Gradualism is a slow change that occurs throughout time, and punctuated equilibrium is they are periods of stability that are interrupted by mass extinctions or rapid changes in the environment, like ice ages, volcanic eruptions, meteorite impacts. Organisms can evolve quickly if they're pushed by changes in the environment. Changes in genes can be passed on, all right, and the if those changes in the DNA sequence are found in the gametes, then it can lead to organisms resulting in major changes in how they physically look. For instance, a small mutation in the DNA sequence can change insect wings from being in two wings to being four wings or two pairs. It can change your leg and arm length from short to long. Uh, we have been able to actually change a single gene in reptiles that have scales, and we can have those scales change into feathers. One specific gene. And we've done this in scientific laboratories where we manipulated a gene sequence, and that reptilian scale became a feather in the next generation. So it's not a far cry to say that reptiles gave rise to birds. They are very similar in nature, and they share a common ancestor. And we can see this in the embryonic development of organisms when we look at major body parts that are formed. All right, so these are all concepts that go along with the ideas of evolution as proposed by Charles Darwin and Lamarck, and all the way through our modern theory of evolution, where we look at the genetic influence of of DNA on the characteristics that we express and how it can lead to a change over time in populations. If you have any questions, of course, get in touch with your teacher. And please remember that you have a Stickleback lab to complete between now and next week. Have a great day and stay healthy.